Welcome, Whispering Bee family. Today, we're stepping into a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and family. Margaret gave her entire life to raising 4 children through loss, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. But when the moment came where she needed them most, only one stood by her side. Stay with us because this isn't just a story about motherhood. It's about the painful truth that family isn't always defined by blood, but by who chooses to show up when it truly matters. You know what nobody tells you about being the person who always shows up? That one day, you'll realize most people only show up when it's easy. The rain was coming down so hard that night, you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Margaret Maddox gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles going white. She probably should have left earlier, before the storm got bad, but how do you say no when Robert's family makes your favorite pot roast? Robert had worked at her fabric store, Maddox Textiles, for almost 15 years, and his wife had spent all afternoon cooking. The warmth of their little house in the suburbs still felt close as Margaret drove the dark road back to her town of Corvallis, Oregon. She was maybe 10 minutes from home when everything changed. The semi-truck came out of nowhere, headlights blinding, swerving into her lane. Margaret yanked the wheel right and her sedan went spinning on the wet pavement. Once, twice. Then the horrible sound of metal crushing against the concrete barrier. The airbag slammed into her face and everything went black. She could hear voices somewhere far away, shouting, sirens cutting through the rain. She tried to open her eyes, but her body wouldn't listen. Pain was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Strong hands lifted her onto a stretcher, and the last thing she heard before she went under was a paramedic saying, "We need to move fast. She's losing too much blood." At Corvallis General, the ER turned into controlled chaos. Dr. Morrison, the senior surgeon on call, examined Margaret fast, his face serious. "Internal bleeding. We need to operate now. Does anyone have her emergency contact?" A nurse went through Margaret's purse and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She scrolled to the emergency contact. The name said, Holly, daughter. The nurse dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then voicemail. "You've reached Holly Williams. I can't take your call right now. Please leave a message." This is Corvallis General Hospital calling about Margaret Maddox. She's been in a serious accident and needs emergency surgery. Please call us back immediately at this number. The nurse hung up and tried again. Same thing, voicemail. Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Try the other contacts." The nurse scrolled through the phone. Another daughter, Emily. She dialed. 4 rings, voicemail. "You've reached Emily Rodriguez. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." The same urgent message was left. Then she tried the son, David. Again, voicemail. "This is David Maddox. I'm not available right now." 3 voicemails. The surgical team waited while precious minutes ticked away. Dr. Morrison was about to proceed without consent when Margaret's eyes opened, just for a second. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. The nurse leaned in close. "Call Maxwell," Margaret breathed. "My son, call Maxwell." The nurse looked at the phone again. There, saved under favorites, was the name, Maxwell. She dialed. On the second ring, a man's voice answered. "Mom, is everything okay? You never call this late." "Sir, this is Corvallis General Hospital. Are you Maxwell Maddox?" "Yes, I'm her son. What happened? Is she all right?" "Sir, your mother's been in a serious car accident. She has internal injuries and needs emergency surgery right away. We need your consent to proceed." There wasn't a moment's hesitation. "I'm on my way. Start the operation. Do whatever you need to do to save her. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Dr. Morrison nodded to his team. "Let's go." As they wheeled Margaret into the operating room, the nurse couldn't help but wonder about the story behind that phone call. 3 children who couldn't be reached, and one who answered immediately, already on his way. But this isn't where Margaret's story begins. It starts 34 years earlier, on a morning that changed everything. Margaret was 28 then, married to her husband James for 6 years. They had 3 kids, Holly, age 5, Emily, age 3, and baby David, just 1 year old. James ran Maddox Textiles, a modest but busy fabric store in Corvallis that his father had started. They weren't wealthy, but they were happy. Their small apartment above the store was always full of kids laughing and the smell of Margaret's cooking. That morning, James kissed her goodbye like always, his hand lingering on her cheek. "I'll be back by lunch," he said. "We've got that big order to deliver to the factory in Portland." But James never came back. The truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. James's delivery van didn't stand a chance. The police came to her door at 2 in the afternoon, their faces telling her everything before they even spoke, and Margaret's world just shattered. The funeral was a blur. Relatives came and went with their empty condolences and emptier advice. "You should move back with your parents," they said. "A woman alone can't run a business. You should sell the store. You should remarry." But Margaret looked at her 3 small children, sleeping peacefully in their beds, not knowing their father would never tuck them in again, and she made a decision. She wouldn't sell. She wouldn't give up. She'd make Maddox Textiles succeed, not just for herself, but for James's memory and for her kids' future. Those early years were brutal. Margaret woke before dawn to make breakfast and lunch for the kids, then opened the store by 7. Holly, even at 5, learned to help watch her younger siblings. Margaret juggled inventory, customers, accounting, and childcare all at once. Some nights she fell into bed so exhausted she could barely remember her own name. But she never missed a parent-teacher meeting. She never forgot a birthday. She never let her children see her cry. The first year was the hardest. Suppliers who trusted James were hesitant to extend the same credit to his widow. Some customers figured the store would close and took their business elsewhere. Margaret had to prove herself over and over. She learned to negotiate harder, to stand her ground when men twice her age tried to cheat her on prices. She taught herself accounting after the kids went to bed, going through James's old ledgers until the numbers made sense. There were nights when she counted the money in the cash box over and over, trying to make it stretch just one more week. There were mornings when she watered down the milk to make it last, telling the kids it was a new recipe. There were winters when she wore 2 sweaters under her coat because she couldn't afford to heat both the apartment and the store, and the customers came first. But Margaret was stubborn. She'd inherited that from her father, a man who'd built a small farm from nothing. She refused to fail. She refused to let James's dream die with him. And slowly, so slowly you could barely see it happening, things started to turn around. A tailor in the next town started buying all his fabrics from her, impressed by her knowledge and fair prices. A bride came in looking for wedding dress material, and Margaret spent 3 hours helping her find the perfect combination. The bride was so happy she sent all her relatives to Maddox Textiles. Word spread. Margaret knows her stuff. Margaret treats you right. Margaret remembers what you like. She expanded what they carried, bringing in new fabrics from suppliers in New York and California. She learned which colors sold best in which seasons, which patterns young brides liked versus older women, which materials worked for everyday wear versus special occasions. She built relationships with tailors and designers across the region, becoming known as someone who could source anything if given enough time. The store became known for quality and fair prices. Money was still tight, but they managed. By the time Holly turned 8, Margaret hired her first employee, an older man named Robert who'd worked in textiles his whole life. He taught her things James never had time to pass on. He became like an uncle to the kids, always sneaking them candy when Margaret wasn't looking. Margaret was careful with every dollar she earned. She saved a portion each month, no matter how small. She bought inventory when prices were low. She negotiated better rent with the building owner. She made deals with suppliers that benefited both sides. Her business sense, hidden beneath her quiet demeanor, was sharper than most people realized. Then one rainy morning, everything changed again. Margaret was walking to open the store when she heard it. A tiny cry, almost lost beneath the sound of the downpour. She stopped, listening. There it was again. She followed the sound to the side of the road where a small basket sat wedged against a lamppost, rain streaming down its sides. Inside was a baby, a tiny infant, maybe only a few days old, wrapped in a thin, soaked blanket. His little face was red from crying, his body shivering from the cold. Margaret didn't think. She grabbed the basket and ran to the store, her heart pounding. She wrapped the baby in dry fabric from the store, warming him against her chest. He was so small, so fragile. Who could leave him there to die? She took him to the hospital. The doctors examined him and said he was healthy, just cold and hungry. "What will you do?" they asked. "We should call child services." Margaret looked down at the baby, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny fist curled against her shoulder. She thought of James, of how much he'd loved children, of how he'd always talked about having a big family. She thought of her own 3 kids and how this little one had no one. "I'll keep him," she said. "I'll raise him as my own." The hospital staff thought she was crazy. Her own family thought she'd lost her mind. "You can barely feed the kids you have," her brother said. "How will you manage with another mouth?" But Margaret had made up her mind. She named him Maxwell after James's favorite uncle. The paperwork was lengthy, the process complicated, but within 6 months, Maxwell was legally her son. Holly, Emily, and David accepted their new brother without question. They were too young to understand the complicated politics of blood and adoption. Maxwell was just their little brother, the baby of the family. Margaret poured everything into her 4 children. She worked herself to the bone, expanding Maddox Textiles bit by bit, hiring employees so she could spend more time at home. She made sure each child had what they needed for school, for sports, for their hobbies. Holly excelled in academics. Emily loved dance. David was gifted in math. And Maxwell, sweet Maxwell, was the gentle soul who loved helping in the store, organizing fabrics by color and texture, chatting with customers. As Maxwell grew, he developed a special connection with the store. While his siblings played basketball in the alley behind the building, Maxwell often chose to stay inside, watching his mother work. He learned to fold fabric perfectly by age 6. By age 8, he could recommend fabrics to customers based on what they described. By age 10, he was helping with inventory, his small hands carefully counting bolts and writing numbers in a notebook. Margaret never pushed him to help. He just wanted to be near her, to understand the world she lived in during the long hours he spent at school. On weekends, while Holly studied and Emily practiced her dance routines and David played with his friends, Maxwell sat at the front desk of Maddox Textiles, doing his homework while greeting customers. The regular customers loved him. They watched him grow from the tiny boy Margaret had found in a basket to a thoughtful young man with kind eyes and a ready smile. When people asked if he was her son, Margaret always said yes without hesitation, without explanation. He was her son, as much as any of the others, maybe more because she'd chosen him and he'd chosen her back. There were hard moments, of course. When Maxwell was 12, a boy at school called him a name, a cruel word meant to shame him for being adopted. Maxwell came home with tears streaming down his face. Margaret held him close, her heart breaking. "Listen to me," she said, tilting his chin up so he had to meet her eyes. "That boy doesn't know what he's talking about. You are my son. You've always been my son. I didn't give birth to you, but I chose you. I chose you that rainy morning, and I choose you every single day. And you know what? That makes our bond even stronger, because it's not an accident. It's a decision. It's love." Maxwell wiped his eyes. "Do you think my real mother didn't want me?" Margaret's heart clenched. "I don't know why she left you. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she thought she was giving you a chance at a better life. But I know this. She gave me the greatest gift I've ever received. She gave me you." From that day on, Maxwell never questioned where he belonged. He was Margaret's son and she was his mother. That was all that mattered. The children grew. The store grew. Margaret's hair started showing threads of silver. Her hands grew rough from years of work, but she never complained. She attended every school function, every recital, every basketball game. She taught them the value of hard work, of honesty, of treating everyone with respect regardless of who they were. She taught them that success without integrity was worthless, that money without compassion was meaningless, that ambition without kindness was just emptiness. When Holly turned 18, she won a scholarship to a prestigious university in Boston. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "Go," she told her daughter. "Make something of yourself. This is everything your father and I dreamed of." Holly left for Boston and rarely looked back. At first, she called every week, excited to share stories about her classes, her new friends, the bustling city life. But as months passed, the calls became less frequent. She was busy with studies, with internships, with building a future. Margaret understood, or tried to. She'd raised her daughter to be independent after all. When Holly came home for Thanksgiving that first year, Margaret prepared all her favorite foods. She cleaned the apartment until it sparkled. She bought new clothes because she wanted her daughter to be proud of her. But Holly seemed distracted, already thinking about getting back to Boston, to the life waiting for her there. She stayed 3 days instead of the planned week, saying she had an important study group she couldn't miss. 2 years later, Emily followed, accepting a job offer in Los Angeles as a marketing coordinator. She'd always dreamed of the big city, the glamour, the opportunities that small-town Corvallis could never offer. Margaret helped her pack, pressing money into her hand for the journey even though Emily protested. "Call me when you arrive safely," Margaret said, hugging her daughter tight. Emily did call that first day, and then the calls became weekly check-ins, brief conversations squeezed between meetings and social events. Emily was thriving in LA. She made friends quickly, moved into a nice apartment with roommates, got promoted within a year. Her life was full and exciting, and Corvallis seemed very far away. When she came home to visit, she talked about restaurants Margaret had never heard of, people with glamorous jobs, parties in the Hollywood Hills. Margaret listened, smiling, proud of her daughter's success, but feeling a growing distance she couldn't quite name. Emily belonged to a different world now, one where mothers who ran fabric stores in small towns seemed quaint and old-fashioned. Then David, with his head for numbers, landed a position at a tech company in Seattle. He packed his bags with barely hidden excitement. The salary was generous, far more than Margaret could have imagined earning at his age. He sent money home the first few months, wanting to help, but Margaret sent it back. "Save it for your future," she wrote. "I'm doing fine." David's calls came mostly on Sundays and usually lasted less than 10 minutes. He was busy, always busy, working long hours trying to prove himself. When he came home for visits, he brought expensive gifts, a new phone for Margaret, a designer scarf, fancy chocolates. But he could never stay long. There was always a project deadline, a client meeting, an important presentation. One by one, Margaret's children flew away. They came home for Thanksgiving, for the occasional family gatherings, but their visits grew shorter, their calls less frequent. Holly married a software engineer named Michael in a big wedding in Boston. Margaret traveled there for the ceremony, overwhelmed by the hotel's luxury, the hundreds of guests, the loud music. She barely recognized her daughter in the heavy wedding dress, surrounded by Michael's wealthy family. Holly hugged her and said, "Thank you for everything, Mom." But the hug felt rushed, done for the cameras. Emily married a business owner named Jake 2 years later. The wedding was in Los Angeles, even more extravagant than Holly's. Emily introduced Margaret to her new in-laws as "my mother who runs a small store back home," and Margaret saw the polite but dismissive looks they gave her simple dress. Her work-worn hands. She felt small and out of place, but she smiled through it all, happy her daughter had found someone successful. David married Rachel, a lawyer in Seattle. The wedding was smaller, more refined, but no less distant. Rachel's family was educated and sophisticated, talking about legal briefs and Supreme Court cases. When they asked Margaret what she did, she said she owned a textile business, and they nodded politely before changing the subject. They were building their own lives, their own families. They sent money sometimes, on Margaret's birthday or for holidays. They called dutifully on Mother's Day. Holly sent pictures of her children, 2 beautiful kids Margaret had met only a handful of times. Emily sent updates about her home renovations and vacation plans. David sent formal emails updating her on his career progress. But they were busy people with important jobs and demanding lives. When Margaret called, she could hear the distraction in their voices, the other conversations happening in the background, the unspoken message that they had more important things to do. She learned to keep her calls short, to not burden them with her loneliness, to always say she was fine even when she wasn't. Corvallis and Maddox textiles seemed very small and very far away from their shining city lives. Their childhood, their mother's sacrifices, the store that put them through college, all of it faded into the background of their busy, successful lives. Margaret felt the distance like a physical ache, but she said nothing. She'd raised them to be independent, to chase their dreams. She couldn't fault them for succeeding. This was what she'd wanted for them, wasn't it? Good jobs, good marriages, comfortable lives. Still, it stung when Holly canceled their planned visit because of a work conference, even though Margaret hadn't seen her in 8 months. It hurt when Emily forgot her birthday entirely, calling 2 weeks later with a breezy apology and a promise to send a gift. It broke something inside her when David asked if he could borrow money for a down payment on a house, but couldn't find time to visit for Thanksgiving, even though she hadn't seen him in over a year. Meanwhile, Maxwell took a position at a manufacturing company in Salem, just 45 minutes from Corvallis. He rented a small apartment there and visited Margaret every weekend. When he married Nicole, a teacher from Salem, he brought her to meet Margaret first, before the wedding was even finalized. Nicole was kind and warm, and she loved Margaret immediately. When their daughter Lily was born, Maxwell and Nicole brought her to Corvallis every Sunday for lunch. Margaret's small apartment, still above the store, once again filled with the laughter of a child. Lily called her grandma, and Margaret's heart felt full in a way it hadn't for years. Meanwhile, Holly, Emily, and David grew more distant. They called on her birthday, sent expensive gifts they'd clearly asked assistants to purchase, and visited maybe once or twice a year, always rushing back to their important lives. Only Maxwell called just to talk. Only Maxwell remembered her favorite flowers. Only Maxwell introduced her to his colleagues as my mother, with pride in his voice, never as my adopted mother, or with any qualifier that suggested she was somehow less than. The years kept passing. Margaret turned 60. Maddox Textiles had grown into one of the most successful businesses in Corvallis. What started as a small store now occupied an entire building with multiple employees and contracts with suppliers across the country. The business was worth far more than anyone knew. Margaret had invested wisely, saved carefully, and built something substantial. She owned the building, had significant savings, and had even purchased a few properties around town. Her children had no idea. They saw only the modest apartment above the store, the same old storefront, their mother's simple lifestyle. They figured she was scraping by, too stubborn to retire, too proud to ask for help. They worried in their distant way that one day she'd become a burden. Only Maxwell knew the truth. He helped her with her accounts sometimes, and he understood that his mother wasn't just getting by. She was thriving. But Margaret had asked him not to tell his siblings, and he respected her wishes. Margaret had already decided how she'd divide her estate. She'd worked with a lawyer to draft a will that split everything equally 4 ways. Even though her biological children barely called, even though they'd made their lack of interest clear, she loved them. They were her flesh and blood. Surely that counted for something. But she hadn't signed the will yet. Something held her back. Some small voice that whispered, "Wait, watch, see." And then came the rainy night, the dinner at Robert's house, the semi-truck that swerved into her lane, and the terrible silence of 3 phones ringing to voicemail while she bled out on a hospital gurney. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Morrison and his team worked carefully, repairing internal damage, stopping the bleeding, stabilizing her vital signs. Maxwell arrived before they were finished, his clothes damp from the rain, his face pale with worry. Nicole came with him, holding his hand tightly. "How is she?" Maxwell asked the nurse at the desk. "Still in surgery. The doctor will update you as soon as he can." Maxwell sank into a waiting room chair, his head in his hands. Nicole rubbed his back gently. "She's strong," she murmured. "She'll pull through." An hour later, Holly finally called the hospital back. "This is Holly Williams. You called about my mother." "Yes, ma'am. She was in a car accident. She's currently in surgery." Oh my God. Is she going to be okay?" "The doctors are doing everything they can. Are you able to come to the hospital?" There was a pause. "I'm in Boston. It's a 6-hour flight, and I have a big presentation tomorrow morning. Can you keep me updated? I'll try to come this weekend if she's still there." The nurse's expression tightened, but her voice stayed professional. Of course, ma'am. Emily's response was similar. LA is so far and I have my daughter's school recital tomorrow. Tell her I'm thinking of her. I'll send flowers. David at least sounded guilty. I wish I could come, but we're in the middle of closing a major deal. I can't leave Seattle right now. Please tell her I love her. But Maxwell sat in that waiting room all night, refusing to leave until he knew his mother was safe. When Dr. Morrison finally came out at 3 in the morning, Maxwell jumped to his feet. How is she? She's stable. The surgery went well. She lost a lot of blood and has some broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, but she'll recover. She's very lucky. Maxwell's knees nearly buckled with relief. Can I see her? She's still sedated, but you can sit with her. Margaret looked so small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes. Maxwell pulled a chair close and took her hand gently. I'm here, Mom, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. When Margaret woke the next afternoon, the first face she saw was Maxwell's. He was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers, his face lined with exhaustion. Maxwell, she whispered. His eyes flew open. Mom, you're awake. How do you feel? Like I got hit by a semi-truck, she said with a weak smile. Which I guess I did. He laughed, but there were tears in his eyes. You scared me. I scared myself, she squeezed his hand. You came. Of course I came. Did you think I wouldn't? Margaret looked around the room. The others. Maxwell's face tightened. They called. They said they couldn't make it. Margaret closed her eyes. She'd known, deep down, what the answer would be, but hearing it still hurt. Mom, you should rest. But Margaret was thinking, remembering, processing. 3 voicemails, 3 children too busy for their mother, and one son who dropped everything to be by her side. Over the next week, as Margaret recovered in the hospital, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Maxwell came every day, bringing home-cooked food from Nicole, helping her walk the halls when the doctor said she needed to move, reading to her when she was bored. Little Lily made her a get-well card decorated with glitter and stickers. The hospital became Maxwell's second home. He learned the nurses' names, knew which doctor was on duty when, understood the rhythm of the ward. He arrived every morning before his mother woke and stayed until visiting hours ended at night. During those long days, Margaret had time to think. Time to reflect on the 3 voicemails, the 3 excuses, the 3 children she'd sacrificed everything for who couldn't be bothered to come when she lay broken in a hospital bed. She thought about all the times she'd excused their absence, rationalized their distance, convinced herself they were just busy. But this was different. This was life and death. This was the moment when family was supposed to matter more than presentations and school recitals and business deals, and they'd chosen not to come. On the 3rd day, a massive bouquet of roses arrived. The card read, "Get well soon, Mom. Sorry I couldn't make it. Work is crazy right now. Love, Holly." Margaret stared at the flowers. They were beautiful, expensive, the kind you sent when you wanted to make a gesture without making an effort. She wondered if Holly had even picked them out herself or if her assistant had ordered them online. A nurse came in to check her vitals, saw the flowers, and smiled. How lovely. Your daughter must care about you very much. Margaret said nothing. What could she say? My daughter cares enough to spend money, but not enough to spend time. On the 4th day, Emily called the hospital directly. The nurse handed Margaret the phone. Mom, how are you feeling? Emily's voice was bright, cheerful, as if she were calling to chat about her day rather than checking on her mother who'd nearly died. I'm recovering, Margaret said quietly. That's wonderful. I was so worried when I got the message. I wanted to come, but you know how it is. Sophia had her recital and she was the lead dancer. I couldn't miss it, but I sent money to the hospital to cover your bills. Did you get it? Yes, I got it. Good. Make sure they give you the best care. Don't worry about the cost. And Mom, I'll try to come visit next month, okay? Once things settle down here. Next month, Margaret closed her eyes. That would be nice. Great, I have to run. Lunch meeting. Feel better, okay? Love you. The line went dead, before Margaret could respond. Maxwell, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, met her eyes. His jaw was tight, his expression carefully neutral. "Mom, you don't have to make excuses for them." "I'm not making excuses," Margaret said, but they both knew it was a lie. On the 5th day, a fruit basket arrived from David. It was expensive, elaborate, filled with imported fruits she didn't even recognize. The card said, "Thinking of you, Mom. Get well soon." Margaret looked at the basket for a long time. Then she asked the nurse to share the fruit with the other patients on the ward. "They'll enjoy it more than I will," she said. Meanwhile, Maxwell sat by her bed and told her about Lily's week at school, about the new project at work, about the garden Nicole was planning. He talked about normal things, everyday things, filling the silence with the comfort of his presence. It had been almost 3 weeks in the hospital when Margaret asked Maxwell to bring her something from home. "In my desk drawer, there's a folder marked legal documents. Can you bring it to me?" Maxwell brought the folder the next day. Inside was the unsigned will, along with the lawyer's business card. Margaret looked at it for a long time. Then she asked Maxwell to call the lawyer. Mr. Patterson arrived that evening, briefcase in hand. "Mrs. Maddox, I was so sorry to hear about your accident. How are you feeling?" "I'm alive, which is more than I deserve after being so foolish," Margaret said. "Mr. Patterson, I need to make some changes to my will." The lawyer nodded, pulling out his notepad. "Of course. What changes would you like to make?" Margaret spoke clearly and deliberately. She left small amounts to Holly, Emily, and David. Enough to show she hadn't forgotten them, but not enough to change their lives. The rest, the business, the properties, the savings, everything she'd built went to Maxwell. "Are you certain?" Mr. Patterson asked gently. "This is a substantial estate. Your other children may contest this." "I'm absolutely certain," Margaret said. "Maxwell is the one who stayed. He's the one who cared. He's the one who answered the phone when I needed him most. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Loyalty does. He's earned this not by being born to me, but by choosing me every single day." Maxwell, sitting quietly in the corner, looked stricken. "Mom, you don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to. I want to. You gave up opportunities to stay close to me. You brought your family into my life. You've never made me feel like a burden. You deserve this." The will was revised, witnessed, and signed that very evening. When Margaret was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, Maxwell took her home, but not to the apartment above the store. He and Nicole had prepared the guest room in their house in Salem. "You're not staying alone while you recover," Nicole said firmly. "You're staying with us until you're completely healed." Margaret had protested, not wanting to be a burden, but Maxwell had been insistent. "Mom, this isn't up for discussion. You're coming home with us." Home with us. Those words settled into Margaret's heart like a warm blanket. The guest room was perfect. Nicole had filled it with fresh flowers, put out clean towels, and stocked the bedside table with books and magazines. There was a framed photo on the dresser, one of Margaret and Maxwell from his college graduation, both of them smiling widely. Margaret lived with them for 4 months. In that time, she watched her son and his family with new eyes. She watched Maxwell go to work each morning, but not before checking on her, making sure she had everything she needed, asking if she wanted him to bring anything home. She watched him come home each evening, tired from a long day, but always stopping to kiss Nicole, to swing Lily into his arms, to sit with Margaret and ask about her day. She watched Nicole care for her with the tenderness of a true daughter, never making her feel like an imposition. Nicole brought her coffee in the mornings, sat with her in the afternoons to chat or watch TV, made her favorite foods even though it meant extra work. She helped Margaret bathe when she was too weak to manage alone, never showing any discomfort or reluctance. She fluffed pillows and changed bandages and gave medications with gentle efficiency. "You don't have to do all this," Margaret said one day, watching Nicole prepare a special soup the doctor had recommended. Nicole looked surprised. "Of course I do, your family." "I'm not your mother." "You're Maxwell's mother, which makes you my mother too. And even if there was no connection, I'd still do this. This is what people do for those they love." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had cared for her like this? When was the last time she hadn't been the one doing all the giving? She watched Lily climb into her lap carefully, mindful of Grandma's injuries, to tell her about her day at school. She listened to stories about friends and teachers, about math problems and art projects, about the butterfly she saw on the playground. Lily brought her drawings to color together, read her picture books, put on impromptu dance shows in the living room to make her laugh. This was what family looked like, not expensive gifts sent from a distance, not phone calls squeezed between meetings, not bouquets of flowers and wired money. Family was presence. It was time. It was care given without resentment, love shown in 1,000 small daily actions. During her recovery, Holly called twice. Both calls lasted less than 5 minutes. She talked mostly about herself, about a promotion she was hopping for, about her son's admission to a good school, about renovating her kitchen. She asked how Margaret was feeling but didn't wait for a detailed answer before moving on to the next topic. Emily called once, a video call where Margaret could see her daughter at a spa, cucumber slices on her eyes. "Just checking in, Mom. You sound much better. That's great. Listen, I'm at this amazing wellness retreat. You should see this place. Maybe when you're all healed we can plan a trip together." But the trip was never planned and Emily didn't call again for 3 weeks. David sent a text every few days. "Hope you're recovering well. Let me know if you need anything." But he never called, never asked for details, never offered to visit even for a weekend. Meanwhile, Maxwell took time off work to be with her during the first 2 weeks of recovery. He worked from home when he could, setting up his laptop at the dining table so he could be nearby if she needed anything. He drove her to follow up appointments with the doctor, waiting patiently in the waiting room, taking notes on the doctor's instructions. Nicole adjusted her teaching schedule to be home more often, finding substitutes for some of her classes so Margaret wouldn't be alone during the day. She made sure Margaret took her medications on time, helped her with the physical therapy exercises the doctor had prescribed. Celebrated small victories, like the first time Margaret could walk down the stairs without help. She hadn't felt this loved, this wanted, in years. Not since James had died had anyone taken care of her the way Maxwell and Nicole did. Not since her children were small had she felt like she mattered this much to someone. And it broke her heart to realize that this level of care, this depth of love, came not from the 3 children she'd birthed and raised, but from the one she'd found abandoned in a basket on a rainy morning 32 years ago. Holly, Emily, and David called occasionally. They were relieved she was okay. They promised to visit soon. They never did. When Margaret was fully recovered, she made another decision. She was 62 years old. She'd worked for 34 years ever since James died. She'd built Maddox Textiles from a struggling store into a thriving business. She was tired. It was time. She called Maxwell to the store one Saturday morning. "I'm retiring," she told him. He looked surprised. "That's wonderful, Mom. You deserve rest. And I want you to take over the business." "Mom, I have a job. I don't know anything about running a fabric store." "You know more than you think. You grew up in this store. You understand fabrics, you understand customers, and you have a good business mind. You can hire managers to handle the day-to-day operations. But this business was your father's dream, and it's been my life's work. I want it to stay in the family. I want it to go to someone who will care for it the way we did. That someone is you." Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "If you trust me with this, I'll do my best to honor it." The transition took several months. Maxwell gave notice at his engineering job and started learning the business from the ground up. Margaret introduced him to suppliers, explained the contracts, walked him through the accounting. She promoted Robert, her loyal employee of 15 years, to general manager. Together, Maxwell and Robert made a good team. Maddox Textiles continued to thrive. Maxwell brought fresh ideas, updating the inventory system, building a website, expanding their online presence. Within a year, the business was doing better than ever. Margaret moved into a new house Maxwell bought for her, just 5 minutes from his own home. She decorated it with photos of all 4 of her children, though she noticed only Maxwell and his family stopped by to visit. She kept a room ready for Holly, Emily, and David, always hopeful they might come. Sometimes they did. Holly came for a weekend when she was between jobs. Emily stopped by with her family during a road trip. David visited for Margaret's 65th birthday, staying for 2 days. Margaret welcomed them with open arms every time. She cooked their favorite meals, asked about their lives, hugged their children. She never mentioned the will. She never threw the accident in their faces. She never said, "Where were you when I needed you?" Because despite everything, they were still her children. She still loved them. But her daily life, her true family, was Maxwell, Nicole, and Lily. Sunday lunches were sacred. Holidays were celebrated together. When Lily had a school play, Margaret sat in the front row with Maxwell and Nicole, beaming with pride. When Margaret had a bad day, Nicole brought her coffee and sat with her. When Margaret felt lonely, Maxwell called, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular. This was what family meant. Not blood, not obligation, but choice. The choice to show up. The choice to care. The choice to love, not just in words, but in actions. 5 years after the accident, Margaret sat in her garden on a sunny afternoon, watching Lily chase butterflies through the flowers. Maxwell was grilling vegetables for lunch while Nicole set the table. "Mom, lunch is almost ready," Maxwell called. Margaret smiled. She was 67 now, her hair completely silver, her hands showing the age of hard work. But she was happy, truly happy. She thought of James sometimes, wondering what he'd think of how everything turned out. She liked to imagine he was proud. Proud that she'd kept his business alive. Proud that she'd raised their children. Proud that she'd opened her heart to a baby left in a basket and loved him as fiercely as any child born of her own body. She thought of the will, locked away in Mr. Patterson's office. Holly, Emily, and David didn't know yet what she'd decided. They'd find out one day when she was gone. She hoped they'd understand. She hoped they wouldn't be too hurt, but she'd made her choice and she was at peace with it. Because in the end, Margaret had learned what really mattered. It wasn't how many children you had or whether they shared your blood. It was who answered the phone when you called for help. It was who sat by your hospital bed through the night. It was who showed up, not just for the easy moments, but for the hard ones too. Maxwell had shown up. He'd always shown up, and that made all the difference. "Mom, are you coming?" Lily called, running up to her and taking her hand. "I'm coming, sweetheart," Margaret said, letting her granddaughter pull her to her feet. She walked to the table where Maxwell and Nicole waited, her heart full of gratitude. She'd lost so much in her life, her husband, her youth, her strength, but she'd gained something precious too. She'd gained the knowledge of what true love looked like. And it looked like this. A simple lunch on a sunny afternoon, surrounded by the people who chose to be there, who wanted to be there, who loved her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Margaret sat down at the table, Lily on one side and Nicole on the other, Maxwell smiling at her from across the way, and she thought, this is enough. This is everything. You know what's wild? We spend so much time worrying about disappointing the people who won't even show up when it matters. And meanwhile, the ones who would drop everything for us, we sometimes take for granted because they're just always there. I want you to think about something for a second. Who in your life is your Maxwell? Who's the person that would answer on the second ring? Who would sit in that hospital waiting room all night, no questions asked? And here's the harder question. Have you told them what they mean to you? Because Margaret spent years making excuses for her biological children. Years convincing herself they were just busy, that their success was what mattered, that distance was normal. And it took almost dying for her to see what had been true all along, that the truest family isn't always the one you're born into. I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to redefine what family means to you? Have you ever realized that the people who show up aren't always the ones you expected? Let's talk about it because I think a lot of us are carrying around this guilt, thinking we're supposed to keep trying with people who have shown us, over and over, that we're not a priority. And if you're someone's Maxwell right now, if you're the one who always shows up, I want you to know something. You're not doing too much. You're not being too available. You're not weak for caring. You're actually the strongest person in the room because real love, the kind that shows up at 3 in the morning, that's rare. That's precious. And the people who receive it and don't treasure it, that's on them, not you. Subscribe if this resonated with you because we're going to keep having these conversations. The real ones. The ones about what happens when the people who were supposed to love you just don't show up. And how you learn to be okay with that. How you learn to redirect your love to the people who actually want it. The whisper today is this: you're allowed to give your best to the people who give you theirs. You're allowed to stop waiting for people who have made it clear they're not coming. And you're allowed to build a family out of the people who choose you, even if they don't share your blood.